Scope 3 reporting is turning disclosure into evidence. In 2026, compliance exposure is increasingly forming long before inspections, enforcement actions, or formal penalties. It is forming inside Scope 3 emissions reporting and third party verification systems, where disclosures intended to demonstrate transparency are now functioning as durable evidence across jurisdictions. Scope 3 emissions, those occurring across a company's value chain rather than within its direct operations, have always been the most complex component of climate reporting. What has changed is how seriously regulators, auditors, investors, and courts are treating this data. Once considered high level estimates, Scope 3 disclosures are now being assessed for internal consistency, methodological stability, and auditability, even when the underlying data remains imperfect. This shift is global, structural, and accelerating. Scope 3 is where most emissions and scrutiny now sit. Across sectors such as energy, manufacturing, transportation, retail, and technology, Scope 3 emissions typically account for the majority of corporate emissions and often represent between 70 and 90% of total emissions, according to global reporting frameworks and disclosure data. That concentration has driven a shift in regulatory attention. If most emissions sit outside direct operations, that is also where credibility risk concentrates. In the European Union, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive requires large companies to disclose Scope 3 emissions where they are material, alongside transition plans, methodologies, and assumptions. Importantly, CSRD does not treat Scope 3 as a secondary disclosure. It embeds value chain emissions into the core of sustainability reporting, with phased assurance requirements that will tighten over time. At the global level, the International Sustainability Standards Board's climate standard, IFRS S2, similarly requires companies to disclose Scope 3 emissions when they are material to climate-related financial risk. Third-party verification is changing the weight of disclosure. As Scope 3 reporting expands, third-party verification is quietly changing its legal and regulatory significance. Research shows that a growing share of multinational companies are seeking limited or reasonable assurance over climate data, including Scope 3 emissions. This is driven by investor expectations, regulatory convergence, and pressure to demonstrate data integrity. Yet assurance does not resolve uncertainty. It formalizes it. Verification requires companies to lock in defined system boundaries, stable methodologies, documented assumptions, traceable supplier inputs. Once verified, Scope 3 figures are harder to frame as provisional. They become repeatable, comparable records that can be examined year over year and cross-referenced against other disclosures, contracts, and regulatory filings. This is where reporting systems begin to operate as evidence systems. Verified Scope 3 data is increasingly referenced in regulatory reviews, investor diligence, supply chain contracting, and in some jurisdictions, litigation and grievance mechanisms, even when enforcement action is not immediate. Supply chain data is the weakest link and the widest exposure scope. 3 reporting extends compliance exposure far beyond the reporting entity. It relies on supplier data that is often incomplete, modeled, or collected under different standards. According to disclosures compiled by CDP, while supplier participation in emissions reporting is improving, data quality and consistency remain uneven, particularly among small and mid-sized suppliers and in emerging markets. Those gaps do not disappear in consolidated reporting, they are embedded within it. In 2026, this creates a structural paradox. Companies are expected to disclose Scope 3 emissions with increasing precision while relying on inputs they do not fully control. When discrepancies emerge between corporate disclosures, supplier submissions, and verified statements, the resulting exposure is not the product of misrepresentation. It is the product of systemic data dependency. Global compliance pressure is reinforcing the shift. Recent global compliance research underscores how quickly this exposure is forming. Analysis from Thomson Reuters shows that 90% of companies report rising regulatory complexity, and 77% of compliance leaders say they are struggling to keep pace with overlapping requirements across jurisdictions. Third-party and supply chain risk, central to Scope 3 emissions, was identified as one of the fastest growing areas of compliance concern for 2026. Notably, the research highlights a shift in oversight priorities away from whether data is disclosed toward whether it is consistent, verifiable, and defensible over time. In this environment, self-reported data is no longer treated as contextual background. It is treated as a signal. Why this is surfacing? Now, this risk did not fully materialize in earlier years because the infrastructure was not yet mature. In 2026, several conditions have converged. Multi-year Scope 3 datasets now exist, enabling trend analysis. Third-party assurance has expanded faster than regulatory tolerance for estimation error. Regulators and investors are cross-referencing climate disclosures with financial filings, transition plans, and operational data. Enforcement agencies globally face pressure to do more with limited resources, increasing reliance on reported records. The result is a compliance environment where exposure forms before rules fully settle and often without any allegation of wrongdoing. A structural shift in global compliance Scope 3 reporting was designed to improve visibility across value chains. In practice, it is also reshaping compliance by turning disclosures into records that travel across borders, regulatory regimes, and legal contexts. The risk is not that Scope 3 data is imperfect. That is widely understood. The risk is that once verified, repeated, and relied upon, imperfect data becomes authoritative by default. Global compliance is no longer shaped only by what companies emit or control directly. It is shaped by what their reporting systems assert and by what third parties are willing to validate. In that environment, managing compliance exposure means managing the life cycle of information itself, long before that information is tested under scrutiny. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.